Welcome to part 6 of Vegas Pro Essentials. I'm going to cover some ways to navigate quickly around the timeline. Some of these are common across editing software, but there are some interesting tricks that are specific to Vegas Pro and a very important function that I'll deal with towards the end of this exercise. The first component I'd like to discuss is the timeline cursor. You've already used it quite a bit, but there is more functionality to help with editing. Firstly, clicking anywhere in the timeline, even selecting events, will jump the timeline cursor to that location. This makes it very easy for you to focus on exactly where you want. If this isn't a behavior you like, you can turn it off in the preferences in the editing section. Another way to use the timeline cursor is to grab it anywhere and drag it left and right to scrub the frames. This is quite a free-form way of moving around. But there are other methods of moving around the timeline which are more controlled. For instance, to go to the beginning or end of the timeline, you can use the navigational buttons in the timeline toolbar. To move even faster, use Control Home and Control End. If you're being very precise and you want to step through individual frames, use the left and right arrow keys. And if you want to browse each event in the sequence, press Ctrl-Alt and use the left or right arrow. Lastly, since you're dealing with time in an edit, you can be very specific with the timeline cursor's position. Double-click on the cursor's position timecode and enter in a value. This works in hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. For example, 5 seconds would be 5.0. To navigate to a timecode without double-clicking in the bottom right corner, just use Ctrl-G for Go, punch in the timecode, and press Enter. So that covers moving around the timeline with the cursor as you're editing. The other aspect of the timeline is playing your edit. Pressing play or spacebar will start and stop playback. This is the most common play behavior. One great little button in the timeline toolbar is Play from Start. So the timeline cursor can be anywhere in the timeline, and this will always play your edit from the beginning of the timeline. Very fast for doing reviews. Another way of playing back your timeline, which is more interactive as you edit, is commonly known as the JKL playback. Saying these out loud feels like a bunch of random keys, but take a look at your keyboard. Your right hand will fall naturally over this set. Press L to go forward and J to go backward. This is a superb way to review something in the timeline like a cut or an effect. K will stop the playback or press spacebar. One unique function to the JKL workflow is that if you push J or K multiple times, this will increase the playback speed in either direction. So you could review something twice as fast, or quickly find the start of a section without having to use the mouse again. Speaking of playback speed, here's a really clever trick that you should know. There is a playback rate control at the bottom left of the timeline. Pulling the slider, you can play the edit at a much more refined rate. This is very good for spotting something specific in video, or listening for a particular sound when the playback rate is very slow. Audio scrubbing is also available directly on the timeline cursor. All you need to do is hold down Control and drag the cursor on the timeline ruler. If you don't drag on the ruler, you won't hear anything, so that's a great tip. Lastly, when it comes to playback, you're always looking at the video preview to see the edit. I sometimes prefer to see my edit full screen without all the controls. So at the top left of the video preview, you can click this button. Your video will go full screen, and you'll control the playback with all the same hotkeys you've just learned, including JKL playback. Press Escape at any time to return back to the Vegas Pro interface. And now for something completely different. As you work in the timeline, you're going to be zooming in and out and moving around, whether you're working on a 30-second edit or a 30-minute edit. We'll now examine some of the different ways of moving through the timeline. In this instance, the middle mouse wheel is a great way to zoom in and out of the timeline very rapidly. Here's a gotcha. Zooming is focused on the timeline cursor. So first choose where you would like to zoom into by clicking the cursor, and then use the middle mouse wheel to zoom in and out. A different way of zooming the timeline is the horizontal scroll bar above the timeline toolbar. You can drag the ends of the scroll bar to zoom in and out of the timeline, and the scroll bar can also pan the timeline horizontally. One other little hidden feature of the scroll bar is that you can double-click it, and it fits the larger timeline area to the view. I use this all the time. This is great for getting a wider perspective of a large edit. If you're not a fan of moving the timeline with the scroll bar, one last suggestion is to place the cursor over the timeline ruler until it changes to a hand. Clicking and dragging the hand will perform the same function without having to go to the bottom of the timeline. Finally, the last timeline function I'd like to bring to your attention is regions. This is a fundamental Vegas Pro function that most people stumble on by accident. If you don't know what they are, they can cause a lot of confusion at first, but don't worry. They're easy to work with and open up some new opportunities. There are in fact two ways to create a region. The first instance is if you drag the timeline cursor above the timeline ruler. This is where I see it happen the most, when new users create a region by accident, and it's nothing to worry about. If you create a region, click the empty space below the events and the region will disappear. The second method of creating a region is double-clicking an event. So what's the point of regions? Regions, as the name implies, is a selected area of the timeline, and it performs a few operations. For instance, using a region selection, you can delete whatever falls in the region. But you would have to explicitly press the delete button, so this is nothing to be concerned about. Without auto ripple, it creates a gap. And with auto ripple on, the events automatically shift to close a gap. Another use of regions is reviewing your edit. This works well with loop playback. You select the area to review and press play. The region will play and continue to loop until you stop the playback. There are a few more uses of regions, but the final one I'd like to cover in this video is regional exporting. This involves selecting a region of the timeline you'd like to render out. This is quite common if you want to show a part of the edit to someone who may be in a different location. When the region is selected, and you go to the render settings, you'll see an option to only render the loop region. You'll cover rendering and exporting in a future video, but this is one of the uses of region selections. In the next video, you'll learn all about grouped events. This is super important because in almost every production, you're going to have sound with your video, and Vegas Pro has a great way of keeping everything in sync. See you shortly.